The form stamped before I could pull my hand back. I heard the mechanism fire, a hard metallic snap, the kind the termination seal makes, and the red ink was already bleeding into the fiber of the intake sheet before I registered what I had done. I looked down. The applicant looked down. We both read it at the same time. Species: human, Terran. Status: extinct. Date of termination: Cycle 7, Year 1402 of the Concordat Standard. The applicant, male, roughly mid-lifespan by the morphology charts, wearing a transit worker's vest with a name tag that read Railmosser in clumsy Concordat script, tilted his head to one side. He had one of those faces that processed information slowly on the outside while something fast was happening behind the eyes. He read the stamp a second time. Then he looked at me. "So," he said, "which box do I check?" I had been a classification intake clerk for 11 years at Station or Rev 12. I had processed Devari refugees, Cal merchant crews, 3 separate applications from a species that did not technically exist under Concordat law but had paperwork proving otherwise, and once, a Vorath elder who arrived at my counter carrying 2 heads and requiring a single file number. I had never, in 11 years, been asked which box to check by a species the system had already declared dead. I looked at the form. The form looked back at me, unhelpfully. The intake terminal offered no override. I knew it wouldn't. The termination flag is a hard lock. Once the seal fires, the file is closed to amendment without a Level 6 authorization, and Level 6 required a senior archivist, a counter-signature from the Bureau of Final Status, and a minimum of 40 days. The human in front of me had presumably not been extinct for 40 days. He appeared, in fact, to have been not extinct for considerably longer. "One moment," I said. I reached under my counter for the supplementary manual. The supplementary manual is a physical document, 1,400 pages, last updated in Cycle 3 of Year 1389, because the Concordat believes that no digital override should exist without a paper counterpart. I had used it twice in 11 years. I opened it to the index. I looked up extinct species, clerical error. There was no entry. I looked up S species, misclassified. The entry read, "See extinct species, clerical error." "I'm not in a hurry," the human said. He had placed both forearms on the counter and was reading the form upside down with what I can only describe as academic interest, the way a technician examines a machine that is behaving incorrectly but in an interesting way. "We have a process," I said. "I don't doubt it." He paused. "Do you need me to prove I'm here?" "I have a transit card." "I have a biometric chip." "I have." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a worn rectangular document, folded twice along the same crease so many times the paper had gone soft there. "I have this. It's a letter from my cargo coordinator at Dock 7. It says I reported for duty this morning." He set it on the counter. I did not pick it up. The letter from his cargo coordinator would not help. The form did not care about letters from cargo coordinators. The form had decided, 40 years ago by Concordat reckoning, that Railmosser's entire species had ceased to exist, and the form was not in the business of reversing its own conclusions based on the testimony of the conclusion subject. I became aware that the line behind him had grown. There were 4 other applicants now, a Kel family traveling together, a Devara technician I recognized from last week's processing queue, and one entity whose species I could not immediately identify, all of them watching the interaction with varying degrees of patience. "I'm going to need to make a notation," I said. "Sure," said Mosser. I pulled a secondary sheet. In the notes field, I began to write, "Applicant presents as living." I stopped. That felt self-evidently redundant. I started again. "Applicant contests termination flag on grounds of." I stopped again. Grounds of what? Existence? I was noting that a living creature was contesting a record of its own death on the grounds that it was, demonstrably, alive. The Concordat had forms for everything. It did not, apparently, have a form for this. "Is this the first time this has happened?" Mosser asked. "The first time I'm aware of," I said, which was honest. He absorbed that. "Is there anyone at a higher level I should speak to?" "The Level 6 authorization process takes 40 days minimum." He nodded slowly, working through it the same way he had worked through the stamp. "And in the meantime, I've got a berth assignment on the Orev freight loop starting day after tomorrow, and I need the transit clearance to board." "Yes," I said. "You do." We looked at each other across the counter. The intake terminal hummed. The termination seal sat in its red box at the top of the form, permanent and certain. The Concordat's considered opinion delivered 40 years before this man was standing in front of me in a transit worker's vest holding a letter from his cargo coordinator. I thought about what I knew about humans. It was not, professionally speaking, a great deal. The termination notice in the Concordat's archive, which I had naturally pulled up on my secondary screen the moment the seal fired, was thin. Cycle 7, Year 1402. Classification, Catastrophic Population Decline, Subtype, Inferred. Surveyor contact lost. No follow-up expedition dispatched. Status defaulted to extinct per Protocol 19, which allowed any species to be reclassified as terminated if surveyor contact lapsed beyond 30 standard cycles without confirmation of survival. The humans had not been confirmed extinct. They had simply not been checked on. 40 years of not being checked on. I looked at Mossa. He was waiting with a patience that I found, in the moment, mildly unsettling. The patience of someone who had grown up accustomed to waiting for systems to catch up with the fact of his existence, who had learned that the gap between what a record said and what was actually true was simply a thing you sat with until someone decided to update the record. I made a decision. It was not, strictly speaking, a legal decision. It was not covered by any provision of the supplementary manual that I had found, and I had now checked the index under H for human, under T for Terran, under M for misclassification, under R for resurrection, which produced no entries at all, and under P for protocols, 19, override of, which also produced nothing. I picked up the intake form. In the lower right corner, below the applicant classification field, there was a checkbox labeled Other, Refer to Senior Archivist. It was a box designed, I believe, for the kind of situation where an applicant genuinely does not fit any available category. A bureaucratic release valve. A small square confession by the Concordat's form designers that the universe occasionally produced something they had not anticipated. I checked the box. I stamped the transit clearance in the processing field below it, Form or Rev 12C, Provisional Clearance Pending Classification Review, and pushed it across the counter. Mossa picked it up and read it. He read the termination seal again, then the other checkbox, then the provisional clearance. He looked up. Will this get me onto the freight loop? The provisional clearance is valid for 60 days, I said. By which time the Level 6 process should have produced a senior archivist willing to sign the amendment. And if it doesn't? I thought about that. Come back to my counter, I said. I'll check the other box again. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, the way humans do it in the morphology charts, but in the neighborhood of one. He folded the form once along its center the same way he had folded the letter from his cargo coordinator, until the crease was clean and exact, and he slid it into the inside pocket of his vest. Thank you, he said. He said it the way you thank someone who has done something ordinary for you, not effusively, not with the particular weight of someone who has just been administratively resurrected from a 40-year death, simply the way you thank a clerk who did his job. He turned and walked away from the counter. I watched him go. The Kell family moved up into his spot. I started pulling their intake sheets, but I kept Mossa's file open on my secondary screen for the rest of the shift. The termination seal sat in its red box at the top. The other checkbox sat in the lower right corner. Between them was the whole disagreement, what the record said, and what had walked up to my counter and asked which box to check. I have been a classification intake clerk for 11 years. I have never requested a Level 6 authorization. I submitted the first one of my career that evening, before I closed the station. The form asked for the grounds of the amendment request. I wrote, Applicant presents as living. This time I did not stop. It seemed, after all, sufficient.